So in the wake of the February 1917 revolution, you had a government in place in Russia called the Provisional Government. And they call it provisional because it wasn't expected to last all that long. It was just kind of a caretaker government to get Russia through the next phase in its political evolution until a more permanent government could be created. And it did end up being very provisional, but not for the reasons envisioned by the people who created it. It only lasted 7 months or so, from February to October. And when we say the provisional government, we are talking about the government run out of the Duma. And this is run mostly by moderates, mostly by liberals, like the Cadet Party or the Octoberist Party, with a number of moderate socialists, some moderate socialist revolutionaries, some Mensheviks in charge. It was led by a really interesting guy named Alexander Kerensky, who lived quite a while in exile. I think he might have lived until as late as the 1970s in exile, I think in the U.S. and in Europe sometimes. He was a socialist revolutionary, and he had been basically a radical. He had spent time in prison in the Tsarist era, and he was well trusted by most of the radical socialists, and so he was also a member of the Petrograd Soviet. He's a very charismatic person, a great speaker. He was what you'd call a ladies' man. He, I guess chalk those up, his character in some ways up to pluses of him basically running the government. And he, when I say he ran the government. He was not always technically the most powerful member of the provisional government, but he filled an assortment of roles and came to be seen as the man in charge of the provisional government. And he did have some downsides. He was very vain. He had an alcohol and a cocaine and a morphine problem, and he was engaging in an affair with his wife's cousin, which sometimes kind of distracted him from the business of running a government. But all in all, he seemed like a good choice at the time. Now, the provisional government, the Duma that is, was recognized by foreign powers, by the Allies, which was the important thing for Russia, and it continued Russia's involvement in World War I. This might be the key mistake that the provisional government made, because you take away the war, and perhaps the Bolsheviks never get a chance to seize power later. The provisional government was in some ways conservative in that it opposed land redistribution, but in a lot of other ways it was it was very progressive and leftist for its time period. It proffered universal suffrage, freedom for workers to form trade unions, all these things that in the other countries of Europe, say Britain, were not necessarily guarantees. But the provisional government, that is the Duma, was not the only power in the country. There was you had what was called dvoye vlasti in Russian. In English, we call it dual power, because power was also claimed by the Soviets, particularly the Petrograd Soviet, and this was a kind of a council, a large council, Congress really, of workers, Marxist intellectuals, soldiers, sailors, and it was much more radical than the Duma, although it wasn't incredibly radical. It wasn't dominated by, say, the Bolsheviks, who were the most powerful radical faction. You had moderate socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, who, all told, agreed in the Marxist line that you would have to have a period of democratic, capitalist, bourgeois government before there was an eventual socialist takeover. And that's one reason that most members of the Soviet did not want to take power, even if Lenin did. The Soviet made a couple of very important decisions early in its existence, February, March 1917. It claimed control over all the weapons in the country, which was very important because it styled itself as the representative body of the soldiers. It declared that soldiers would only obey orders from the Provisional Government if the Soviet agreed, thus basically turning the Soviet into the real government of the country, in theory, if not in practice. And very importantly, it did a good job of coordinating with other Soviets throughout the country and kind of building up Soviet power in a way that the Provisional Government wasn't necessarily able to do after the collapse of the Tsarist regime. All right, so these two sides, the Duma and the Soviet, they managed to cooperate fairly well in the beginning. They were both meeting actually in the same building, the Tauride Palace, which an old kind of grand palace of the Tsars. And there's only one member of both of these bodies, Kerensky, which makes sense. He's very popular among everybody. In the beginning, the Provisional Government, the official government, did things that were basically popular among the people and acceptable to the Soviets. They arrested the old members of the Tsarist regime. They dissolved the Okhrana, the secret police that had terrorized the socialists for so long. They gave amnesty to political prisoners, civil rights and freedoms, abolition of discrimination and the death penalty, and a promise of an upcoming vote, a fair democratic vote to determine Russia's future. That is the future government of Russia. So all things that were quite popular. But cooperation didn't last forever because back came Lenin. Lenin had been in exile in February 1917. The revolution took him by surprise as well, even if later on he was styled as the leader of the February Revolution. And he got back from exile with the cooperation of Germany, of which he was no fan. He detested the German government as well as the Russian government. But Germany thought that Lenin's ideas could infect or undermine the Russian Provisional Government, with which Germany was then still engaged in a war. So Germany stuck Lenin in a sealed train to make sure he couldn't get out, and shipped him back to Russia via Sweden. First thing Lenin does when he gets off the train is announce all of these things that really even other Bolsheviks generally disagree with, very radical ideas that are known as the April Theses. The April Theses, in short, call for an immediate end to the war, the end of cooperation with the Provisional Government by the Soviet, for the Soviet to take power, that is, to actually overthrow the Provisional Government in all its kind of different facets, to redistribute land immediately to the peasants, whether that would be legally or just to post fact say, peasants, you've grabbed the land, great, it's yours, we agree. He called for a worldwide socialist revolution, which in terms of Marxist theory, even if Leninism kind of flipped on its head the idea of where the socialist revolution would take place and said that it would happen in the weakest link among the capitalist countries, Lenin still expected one socialist revolution to kind of lead to a worldwide uprising of all the developed proletariat. And this very radical program set the Bolsheviks apart and made them definitely not immediately the most popular group in the country or in the capital, Petrograd, but it made them a true alternative to these other more or less moderate and cooperative socialist parties. And further helping the Bolshevik cause was Lenin's ability to really, or Lenin and the other Bolsheviks' ability to really just sum up their demands in short, memorable to maybe less educated workers or peasants phrases: peace, bread, and land, bread, peace, and land, and all power to the Soviets. The Bolsheviks repeated these again and again and again, drummed them into the heads of everybody. So, as 1917 went on, the provisional government misplayed its hand in a lot of ways. And there were a lot of ups and downs during this time period. I don't want to give you the idea that it was just nothing but steady losses for the provisional government. But there were a series of mistakes and lost opportunities by Kerensky and the provisionals. There was, maybe most importantly, the summer offensive that Kerensky launched against Germany. A very big mistake. To some extent, it helped rally nationalists behind the provisional government, and these new battalions, including my favorite, the Women's Death Battalion, were formed in order to kind of overwhelm the Germans, but it didn't last. The offensive fell apart within several days, and that just led to increasing alienation from the provisional government by soldiers who deserted, who killed their own officers, who refused to fight, who joined, went AWOL, moved to Petrograd, and joined the Bolsheviks. You had the provisional government's decision on land, and I don't want to give you the idea that the provisional government agreed entirely, unanimously about issues like land. There were a lot of different groups within the provisional government: the socialist revolutionaries, the Mensheviks, the cadets, the Octobrists. But these different groups could not agree fast enough to create a legal framework by which land would be redistributed to the peasants. They could not do this before October. Meanwhile, authority in rural areas was basically just melting away, and the peasants were taking the land anyway without a legal framework. One great thing Lenin did in terms of, I guess, capturing that wave was to recognize that there was nothing that could be done to slow redistribution. So Lenin just stepped on what he saw as the side that would ultimately have its way, whether or not Lenin was leading or following. You had another big problem was the different competing nationalisms that the provisional government was either fighting or expressing. The government itself was a Russian nationalist government. It wanted to win the war in part to expand Russian territory, take things like, say, Constantinople, which Russia had wanted for so long, to to take other land in the West, that is, in Russia's West and Germany's East. But other groups, other ethnic groups of which we've talked, like the Poles, the Finns, the Georgians, or the Armenians in the Caucasus, were trying to get either more autonomy or outright independence from the provisional government, and the government's lack of ability to grant anything like this helped alienate those other groups. And finally, the economy really gnawed at the popularity of the provisional government, and even of the more moderate factions within the Soviet. All of the previously mentioned economic problems, the hunger, the lack of fuel and supplies in the capital, the confiscation of grain from the peasants, all of these things were continuing. And as long as Russia stayed in the war, there was very little that the government could do to actually confront or potentially stop these things from occurring. And potentially the straw that breaks the camel's back is what's known as the Kornilov affair. The Bolsheviks had been growing more and more popular over the summer of 1917. They'd been recruiting new members, most importantly Trotsky, who finally became a member late in the summer. And they were tapping into these huge frustrations of workers, radical or not, of soldiers who were hungry, they were unpaid, they were on strike, they were living conditions were really awful, and these tensions boiled over in what were called the July days for 3 or 4 days in early July 1917, you just had a massive riot throughout Petrograd, which Kerensky suppressed. The government called in some troops. It put down these street riots, with a number of casualties. The Kerensky tried to arrest, not very successfully, a lot of the leading Bolsheviks who he saw as behind the unrest. And so Lenin escaped. I believe he went to Finland. And Kerensky made the really bad decision that he needed to call in the supreme head of Russian forces to truly quell the unrest in the capital. And this was General Kornilov. Kornilov, interesting character as a son of Cossacks. He's a lot of times Kornilov, his views are not quite clear, and people, especially the conservative landowners, were able to, in some ways, put their own ideas upon him. But whatever Kornilov's ultimate plans were, he did represent a kind of counter-revolutionary push, and he moved towards the capital of Petrograd. And there's a very good chance that he would establish military control of the city, martial law, and potentially even seize power himself, although that's some things are unclear. But Kerensky panicked at this. This was not what he wanted, and if the army under Kornilov is advancing on the capital and you need to keep them out, who are you going to call? Well, the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, the workers, the Red Brigades, as the Bolshevik paramilitary groups were called. And so Kerensky called them out to protect the city. They did this. You had railroad workers who destroyed the tracks around the city, thus keeping Kornilov from getting close. You had soldiers who infiltrated Kornilov's army and persuaded people to refuse to follow orders. All of these things. Kornilov himself was arrested, and the end result of this, of the Kornilov affair in August 1917, was that Kerensky basically was a spent force. He was no longer seen as really even in charge of the provisional government in an effective way. You had your moderate socialists, your moderate SRs, and your Mensheviks were also discredited because they were associated with Kerensky. The liberals, like the cadets and the Octoberists, were seen as tools of the big industrialists and the landowners, so they were no longer very popular at all among the mass of the people. And most importantly, perhaps, the Bolsheviks began to dramatically rise in power after the fall-off they'd suffered following the failure of the July days.